Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh-Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting the latest headlines from the Arabiya studio. These are our top stories. Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff visits an aid distribution site in Rafah as the UN warn of a potentially politically man-made famine in Gaza. The US reveals fresh tariffs for over 90 countries, with Canada and Brazil facing higher levies. And NASA and the Russian Space Agency meet face-to-face for the first time in 7 years to discuss continued collaboration in space. President Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff and the US ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee are in Gaza today as concerns grow about the humanitarian crisis in the region. Witkoff and Huckabee have visited a food distribution site in Rafah and plan to report their findings to President Donald Trump immediately. Local aid workers have warned of a man-made famine in the area. However, Israel have denied claims that they are to blame, maintaining they have been working to facilitate and ease the distribution of aid in the Strip. I'm now joined by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Palestine, Varsen Aghabekian. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. So as I was just saying there, US Envoy Steve Witkoff has visited a GHF aid site in Gaza today. What will be achieved from this visit, and what message will Witkoff take back to Washington?
First of all, it's questionable why the visit is taking place, because what is happening in Gaza is crystal clear, and we have been seeing it unfolding for the last 22 months. What we see in Gaza is mass destruction, starving people, emaciated body, and death everywhere. This is a very well-known fact. It doesn't need any confirmation. International organizations have been saying it. The footage is clear about it. We have reports coming out from various entities confirming the situation in Gaza. And I hope that he takes back the real picture, because we are confident and very sure that what he will see is the massive destruction, the starved people, and the smell of death everywhere. What is needed in Gaza today is measures on the ground to stop this war and to ensure humanitarian assistance going in as soon as possible.
This visit comes as pressure mounts on both the US and Israel over the humanitarian situation in Gaza, which you were just explaining to me. It's extremely desperate. UN figures out today say nearly 1,400 people have been killed at aid sites. But Israel is denying claims they are starving people, blaming it on Hamas. International journalists like myself are not allowed into Gaza to see the true reality. What is your analysis of the situation, and what have you seen yourself? What are you hearing?
What we're hearing and what we're seeing is the deaths. Yes, 1,300 Gazans were killed brutally, queuing for food, and over 8,000 were injured, also queuing for food. I think the pictures speak on the situation in Gaza. The reports from international organizations, from Israeli organizations, that are saying very clearly that what is happening in the Gaza Strip is genocide, and with all the pillars of genocide, including the starvation of the people. So the situation is clear.
We have had cautious optimism in the past when it comes to a ceasefire deal. However, those talks did break down. Could we see a breakthrough in the coming days, as this seems to have become a priority for President Donald Trump? So should we be cautiously optimistic about a deal?
We should always stay optimistic, because for me as a Palestinian, my utmost priority is to save lives, because every day passes, it means more loss of Palestinian lives. And this war is stoppable. If the United States wants to stop the war, it can stop it, because it has done so elsewhere, and it can do it in Israel-Palestine.
So you say the US can stop this war, but why aren't they stopping this war? What's your analysis of why this isn't happening?
Because they are in line with what Netanyahu wants. Netanyahu doesn't want this war to stop. Netanyahu wants to continue this war for personal interests, and he's in line with his extremist ministers in his coalition. He says no to a state, no to a Palestinian state, no to Hamas, no to the Palestinian Authority, yes to annexation. And his extreme ministers are saying blatantly yes to Gaza and all Jewish Gaza.
Canada, the UK and France have broken ranks with the US and said they are willing to recognise a Palestinian state. However, with conditions, are these countries, as President Donald Trump says, wrongly rewarding Hamas?
No, they're not rewarding Hamas. They are in line with international law, and they are in line with the rights of the Palestinian people, and they are in line with people's rights to self-determination.
So what kind of pressure, if any, are you and the Palestinian Authority applying to convince Hamas to negotiate and to release the hostages? Are you in direct talks with Hamas? Is there pressure on them to change their stance to save the starving people within Palestine?
We are not in direct talks with Hamas, but we are in direct discussions with countries that are mediating discussions with Hamas. And our line is that as soon as possible, the hostages should be released, and this war needs to stop, and we need to take care of the Palestinian people at large in Gaza and the West Bank.
If we have a look at the West Bank and we have a look at Gaza, do you think international law has broken down when it comes to supporting and keeping these areas safe?
Yes, international law has not done any service to the Palestinian people. International law is very clear about occupied territory, and the ICJ ruling was also very clear about it. And we have yet to see international law and the countries that believe in international law put pressure with measures on the ground to curtail this occupation that has been nothing but expanding by the day. And the meeting in New York is a good platform to build on that momentum so that we move on with measures on the ground that will help us materialize the state of Palestine, end this war, and develop a Palestinian state on par with other states of the world.
Do you believe a two-state solution can still be achieved?
Yes, because the two-state solution is the only viable solution. The two-state solution respects the dignity of the Palestinian people and respects the security of Israel and the two states living in peace and security side by side. Any other solution will not grant any peace or security, not for Israel, not for Palestine, and not for the region. And we will not accept to continue living the status quo, which is a status quo of apartheid. And a one-state solution will not be viable because Israel will not accept a one state for all its citizens.
Last night, the US State Department added new sanctions on the Palestinian Authority officials, very much like yourself. What does this mean for you and for the PA? You are obviously in New York at the moment. Did that come as a shock?
It did not come as a shock because the sanctions by the United States are not new. They have been putting impediments on the PLO and the PA for some time now, and they keep reminding us of these sanctions on a monthly basis. But now maybe they're more vocal about it, probably because of the results of the New York conference. But I think it will put pressure on all sides, but I don't think it will be it will not curtail our efforts towards the September conference.
And Varsen, As I did say, you are in New York at the moment. What would your message be to Donald Trump and the Republican Party for those people in Palestine, like yourself, you're Palestinian, and the people that you support?
I will say that the rights of the Palestinians have been violated for too long. If the United States, and specifically President Trump, is for peace, and we know that he is, and he wants to forge peace in the area, then the rights of the Palestinians need to be respected. The only way this can happen is to go along with what international law says. International law is clear: 2 states for the 2 people living side by side in peace and security.
Varsen Aghabekian, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Palestine. It was a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you for joining me. Let's get into this further with former U.S. Deputy Special Envoy Ellie Cohanan. Emmy, great to have you on the show. Thank you for joining me. The U.S. ambassador has actually talked up the success of the controversial GHF aid group after the visit today in Rafah. We've just heard from the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Palestine there. The purpose of this visit was to get to the truth of the aid situation inside of Gaza, which has caused absolute outrage, Ellie, across the world. Do you think this has been achieved? Do you think the truth will be revealed?
The footage I saw of Special Envoy Steve Witkoff in Gaza this morning, U.S. time, is Gaza civilians cheering him and so thrilled that that a U.S. representative is there on the ground to fact find and see the situation for himself. And Leigh-Ann, what I can share with you personally is just yesterday I was presenting at a conference here in Washington, D.C., where the keynote speaker was the Reverend Johnny Moore, who runs the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. And he shared with us that GHF is now delivering 1 million meals per day in Gaza, that they have been the only honest food distribution delivery mechanism in Gaza. He slammed the United Nations for what he considers a complete failure on the UN's part to really do their part. I've also seen so much video footage of trucks filled with food aid sitting at the borders of Gaza that the United Nations has refused to distribute to Gazans. And so, I don't think anyone would deny that there's hunger in Gaza, but the finger to blame very much seems at the United Nations. The UN has this pattern where everywhere they're sent to actually do a duty and carry out a responsibility, they seem to fail at it, and then they try to fool the international community about their own failures. So I would tell you that I think this GHF system is the best system that has been put in place, and anyone who wants to help should support its efforts like the United Arab Emirates is doing right now.
Ellie, what I find interesting is when Israel faces any criticism about the aid situation within Gaza, they seem to put a spin on it. And I'm hearing what you're saying, but if I actually bring you some figures from the UN, who you say is being criticized by certain people, they say more than 1,300 aid seekers killed in Gaza since May. We have had daily reports that people have been dying at the GHF sites. I've spoken to doctors with inside Gaza who say children are coming in with shots to the shoulders, shots to the head, and this is how they've been killed trying to get food. Is anyone taking responsibility for the situation there? Because I feel like Israel is somewhat deflecting the truth.
Well, the responsibility falls on Hamas. I mean, there's been footage revealed where Hamas sees Gazans trying to get at the aid, and then they start to shoot live at these civilians who are trying to get at the aid. We've seen footage of Gaza literally assaulting and leaving people bruised and blackened after assault because they tried to get at this food aid. Look, I think the reality that everyone needs to be very open-eyed and clear-eyed and aware is that Hamas is a terrorist organization. They are hanging on to power in Gaza. They will do anything they can to disrupt this food aid. They will do anything they can to try to hold on to power. And what we saw just this week was unprecedented. The Arab League made a united statement. They condemned the October 7th attack by Hamas, and they've called on Hamas to disarm and disband. And the reality is that is the only path forward. It's the only future for the people of Gaza is for Hamas to leave, to take any exit that they're being offered by the Arab League, by the United States and Israel, and to allow the citizens of Gaza to move on with their lives, presumably under some sort of plan which would bring in the Arab neighbors of Gaza, states like the UAE, hopefully the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and others to help rebuild Gaza and move on from this war. But this war will only end when Hamas disbands, hopefully releases the hostages, and exits the area.
There is a lot of international and domestic pressure on President Donald Trump right now to reach a ceasefire deal. But I was just listening to you there and many people I've had on the show. If we listen to both sides, Hamas and Israel, it seems a breakthrough is somewhat impossible because we're so far away when it comes to this. One side wants something completely different. Where does this end? And what kind of pressure can Donald Trump put on Israel and both sides to make sure something happens here, especially for all the civilians, Ellie, who are starving to death?
Right. Well, I think, again, that all interested parties, people who are concerned for the hunger in Gaza, should do their best to support the GHF effort to help distribute more food. But in terms of how do you bring this war to an end, what we've heard over and over again is that the Israeli side has accepted every U.S. proposal that has been put forward, and it is Hamas that rejects these proposals time and time again. So remember, Hamas is a foreign terrorist organization, and so they're not necessarily rational actors. And so the reality is that for this war to come to an end, the pressure on Hamas must be increased so much so that they understand there is no tomorrow for them, there's no future. If you think about the alternative and you ask, what is the pressure that could be put on the Israeli side? Well, what happens if Israel were to just, cease fire today? Well, what happens is that Hamas is given the opportunity to regroup, and then they will just go on massacring not only Israelis, but their own people as well. And so I think that there is one consensus, which is that there is no return to the pre-October 7th status quo. The Trump administration will never ask Israel to do that. The Israeli people will never accept that from their government, whatever government will be in power. And certainly I don't even think the people of Gaza want a pre-October 7th status quo. And so again, the only way to help Gaza move on to the next phase in their existence is for Hamas to disband, and the pressure has to be completely on Hamas. And whatever political leadership still exists in Doha, that political leadership needs to feel the pressure. I hope anyone who's continuing to funnel monies to Hamas will be pressured to stop doing that. And hopefully we will see them disarm and disband as the Arab League has demanded that they do.
Ellie Cohannon, former US Deputy Special Envoy, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, it's the 1st of August, President Trump's tariff deadline, and the US has revealed new tariffs affecting over 90 countries. Those hardest hit are Canada, whose rate rises from 25% to 35%, and Brazil, who face a 50% levy. Meanwhile, Mexico has been spared for another 90 days. To discuss this in more detail, I'm joined by economist Vicky Price. Vicky, great to have you on the show. Lots of anticipation ahead of the tariffs that were due to come in. So let's begin with the bigger picture. How damaging could this sweeping wave of tariffs be for the global economy, especially coming from the world's largest importer, America?
Well, very damaging. If you look at some of the countries that are affected, they consider the US to be their main export destination. But of course, a number of countries are not going to be that affected because the US doesn't matter very much. But what matters for them, particularly looking at the smaller Southeast Asian countries, matters what happens in countries near them. And if those countries have been affected by tariffs or, their flows of goods have changed necessarily in order to avoid some of those, then they're affected as well. And remember that loads and loads of companies have gone and, in order to avoid some of the tariffs or the restrictions that have existed in the US actually for some time against particular countries, they've gone and produced elsewhere or set up production elsewhere. And Mexico, of course, comes to mind immediately because, of course, a lot is produced there and in Canada and then exported to the US. And that was done to facilitate, if you like, the sort of trade between, those regions, but also to avoid some of the restrictions that were there anyway and take advantage maybe of lower labor costs. But they're going to have huge problems selling to the US now, given those tariffs, which are very high, both in Canada and in Mexico. Overall, I think for the economy, since you're asking that, originally, if you look at just a few months ago with Liberation Day, but also slightly before, everyone was downgrading the forecast very significantly. By Liberation Day, of course, I mean the announcement of the big increase in tariffs that President Trump made in the beginning of April. They had been downgraded. And what has happened now is because those rates are slightly better across the world than had been envisaged, we've seen, for example, the International Monetary Fund up its forecast slightly for growth in 2025 and 2026 for the world economy. So, we should be grateful for small mercies, I'd guess, right now.
Yes, small victories. And I just want to let everyone know this is the third edition of Trump's Tariff Liberation Day. As we know, Vicky, it was postponed a couple of times ahead of theirs. But let's just focus in on Canada slightly. Trump has linked the tariff hike on Canada to fentanyl smuggling, even though Canada accounts for just 1% of US fentanyl imports. And this comes despite an earlier exemption under the trade deal. How common is it for trade policy to actually be used in this way? And what does it say about the reliability of trade agreements under Trump's economic agenda, which we know is protectionist?
Well, we do know that trade and sanctions particularly, but also tariffs have been used as a political measure. I mean, after all, there are loads and loads of sanctions against Russia right now, and they have been increased, if anything. They're now going to be extra tariffs on goods imported into the US by countries that are dealing directly with Russia. So, for example, this is exactly what's happening with India, which has suddenly seen tariffs to the US go up very significantly. With Canada, yes, you're quite right. A lot of the fentanyl trade is the issue. And Canada was meant, and this is why there was a pause for a while, was meant to have done something in terms of drug trafficking across its borders. President Trump thinks they haven't done so. It is possible that he's also reacting to the fact that Canada has said they're going to recognize the Palestinian states in the autumn. Remains to be seen whether that happens. There's lots of conditions attached. So it could be that. But I think it is interesting. You mentioned the trade deal that existed already, and you're absolutely right. Some 90% of the exports to the US going from Canada are going to be exempt completely because, or at least they're going to have the tariffs that had been agreed at that time. So they will still fall under the agreement that was made in terms of the US, Canada, Mexico agreement, which, as you remember, replaced NAFTA, which was the agreement that was there before, which was changed to improve a little bit the position of the US in that, but the other countries accepted it. And that's been going on for some time. So we've got to bear in mind, we hear those figures, very high tariffs that don't apply across all products.
And the big question really is, with companies likely to pass on the cost to US consumers, what kind of impact or inflationary impact might we expect? Are people going to be paying a lot more at the till? I know Donald Trump previously said that there will have to be short-term pain for long-term gain, but how long are people going to put up with that?
Oh, it's a very interesting question. I mean, the truth is that until now, they haven't really seen any great effect on prices coming out of this, and inflation has remained under control in the US. We've seen the latest data, which actually is quite close to target of 2%. I think what happened originally is that everyone exported to the US to try and avoid those tariffs. And we've seen a big increase in production in various countries, including in Europe, but also China and elsewhere, and a lot of exports to the US when they were trying to beat those tariffs, which they knew were going to be imposed, although we didn't quite know at what rate. And what happened, of course, is that the US economy shrunk in the first quarter slightly as a result of that, because of so many imports coming in. And that's the way GDP and economy, gross domestic product, is calculated. In the second quarter, what we've seen, the consumer, and of course businesses that have been bringing things in, didn't do that. In fact, went the other way. And imports fell very significantly, and GDP rose in the second quarter. But it means the consumer has less choice, possibly looking ahead, and those price increases will come. And it is one of the reasons why interest rates have stayed high in the US. As we know, there was a decision just a couple of days ago to leave interest rates unchanged by the Fed, which really infuriated President Trump. But I think it is because they're waiting to see what the eventual impact of those tariffs might be before they decide how to move.
Yes, Donald Trump had some furious words for Jerome Powell after that FOMC meeting. Economist Vicky Price, a pleasure to have you on. Thank you. Let's take a look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. The death toll from Russia's recent missile and drone strike on Kyiv has risen to 31, including 3 children. Ukraine's Interior Ministry said rescuers retrieved 10 bodies from the rubble on Friday morning, including a 2-year-old child. 159 others were wounded in the attack. President Trump has called the strikes disgusting and warned that new sanctions against Moscow were coming. At least 1 worker has died and 5 others are missing after a copper mine collapsed in Chile. It's been caused by an earthquake that struck on Thursday evening. Rescuers at the mine, which is 100 kilometers from Santiago, continue to work in the area. Chile is the world's leading copper producer and provides nearly a quarter of the global supply. Severe storms and flooding have hit the east coast of the United States, prompting a state of emergency across New York and New Jersey. The New York governor is urging all residents to stay vigilant, stay informed, and use caution. Airports in the area have reported significant delays and also cancellations. And the White House has announced plans for a new $200 million ballroom. It will be built in the East Wing of the White House, where First Lady Melania Trump's office is currently located. Funds for the project have been paid directly by President Trump, as well as anonymous donors, with work expected to start in September. The New York Times has reported the Taiwanese president has cancelled plans to transit through to the US next month. Stopovers made by Taiwanese leaders have infuriated Beijing, and trade talks between the US and China are at a sensitive stage. Since President Trump returned to power, the question of Taiwan's future has become a cause of concern. Yana Li explains why Taiwan has been preparing for a possible Chinese invasion.
In the middle of the day in downtown Taipei, pedestrians are taking cover. And in seconds, the streets are empty. No need for panic, though. This is just a drill. Taiwan is preparing for a Chinese invasion, and the government wants its people to be ready.
In the current circumstances, especially regarding all these different threats or different challenges or risks we face, I think we need to be more prepared in any kind of situation.
Drills have taken place every year for 4 decades, but this summer they lasted 10 days instead of the usual 5. The military too have been testing real-life scenarios. In Penghu, an archipelago that sits between Taiwan's main island and China, soldiers pretend to respond to an amphibious invasion. Pressure is mounting from neighboring China. President Xi Jinping has been reiterating his desire to control Taiwan and has ramped up military drills around the Taiwan Strait. Beijing sees the democratic, self-ruled archipelago as a breakaway province. Combined with a more assertive leader in Taipei and an unreliable president in Washington, the new normal is changing in Taiwan. Yana Li for Al Arabiya English in Beijing.
Let's take a look at the top business news now. US job growth slowed in July, with unemployment expected to hit 4.2%, but it's not enough for the Fed to cut rates. June's gains were boosted by a short-term jump in education jobs, now pulling back. Fed Chair Jerome Powell says the labor market is in balance, though tariffs and immigration rules are raising costs and shrinking the workforce. Heathrow has announced a £49 billion expansion plan, including a third runway and new terminals. The government has indeed backed it, saying it will boost trade and connectivity. But environmental groups and local leaders warn it will increase noise pollution and hurt climate goals. A rival £25 billion plan offers a cheaper option without moving the M25. And turning to the sports news now, tennis star Coco Gauff has battled back from a set down to reach the last 16 of the Canadian Open, outlasting Veronika Kudermetova in a 2.5-hour thriller. But on the men's side, shock stole the spotlight. Daniil Medvedev was ousted by Australia's Alexei Popyrin, while their third seed Lorenzo Musetti also fell. Germany's Alexander Zverev also notched his 500th tour level win after a comeback victory. An Olympic and world champion sprinter Noah Lyles has cruised through his 100-meter heat in 10.05 seconds. Kennedy Barnack was the only runner under 10 seconds with 9.95. Sha'Carri Richardson ran her season best 11.01 in the women's 100 prelims. NASA has held a rare face-to-face meeting with Russia's space agency Roscosmos for the first time since 2018. The talks took place at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida on Thursday. Sean Duffy and Dmitry Bakanov discussed the continued cooperation and collaboration in space, including moon missions and the International Space Station. The meeting was significant given the current situation in Ukraine with declining investments in Russia's space efforts. We can now speak to the astronaut Per Wimmer, who is in Copenhagen for us. Per, thank you so much for joining us. So NASA and Roscosmos have worked together for many years. How important is the relationship between the two organizations?
Historically, it's always been a very important relationship. If you look back in time, space has really been an area for collaboration, whatever's been happening on planet Earth. Yes, we had the space race back in the Kennedy days, where the Americans were trying to get to the moon first and famously did it ahead of the Russians, even though the Russians were ahead in the space race game, if you look back in the 1960s. But since then, it has been more a question about collaboration, irrespective of Earth politics. Hence why we have the International Space Station, where, for instance, the Russians are supplying the thrusters to the ISS. The Canadian has a big arm on there, and everybody's sort of contributing, whether it's the Europeans via ESA or NASA with the Americans or the Japanese. In fact, it has truly been an international collaboration. But things started to change a bit after the Ukrainian invasion, where it seems like Earth politics were starting to hit space, and we saw the Russians going increasingly independent, and the Americans doing that way. So today is actually a quite interesting coming back together moment in space, at a very interesting time on Earth politics, because as we see, Trump is getting increasingly frustrated with Putin and Russia for their continued actions in Ukraine. And yet here we have in space, it seems like we can still collaborate, and we have the meeting of the two heads. So it's quite significant, actually, in political terms, and certainly also in space terms.
Yes, so you talk about space and Earth politics, which I think is a wonderful way to explain things. But how much of an effect has global politics had when it comes to space collaboration? You were just talking about it there, but it seems like Russia is becoming increasingly marginalized. And what does their space program look like now from when we remember it back almost 20 years ago? And do they still have finances on their side?
Until the Ukrainian war started, it was very much a question about collaboration on both sides. It was almost like space was a bit immune. Part of that was because space is scientific; it's the common quest for humankind. But it did seem like the Earth politics couldn't reach the outer space. However, there was also another argument and a reason for that, and that's because for a period of time, the Americans did not have access to space, to the International Space Station. They simply did not have, after the space shuttle was retired, access to go to space, to go to orbit. So they had to rely exclusively on the Soyuz rocket. So there was also a bit of necessity towards the end of it. But after the Ukrainian war, things changed. Russia went a lot more independent. China has got their own space station up there today and doing their thing. So there has been a little bit of a breakup in terms of this collaboration, although occasionally the agencies do get together. So, for instance, when Chang'e 4, the Chinese mission, landed on the dark side of the moon, they could not have done that amazing feat if it wasn't with a bit of help from NASA, with a bit of help from the Europeans as well, and Russians as well. It was actually a nice collaboration, even though it was less advertised. It was more presented as a Chinese victory, but it certainly was collaboration. So there is in the scientific community a desire to stay away from politics as much as possible, but obviously it does affect. In terms of the budget on the Russian side, yes, I mean, a lot of that is going to the war machine at the moment. So clearly resources are being directed, and it's perhaps less important to be seen as a space conqueror just for the pride and prestige. But when it comes to the military side of things, be under no illusion, there is a lot of dollars being invested also on the Russian side in terms of military capabilities from space.
Yes, and of course, drones and AI have become a big thing when we look at the Ukrainian-Russia war that's happening. But finally, Per, I want to speak to you a little bit about space travel. And we sort of touched on this earlier, but it was always about the countries, wasn't it? It was about Russia, who was the first person to get to the moon, and all of those big moments that we remember. But I feel like things have changed a lot now. Now we look at the big companies leading the space race. Of course, we've got SpaceX, we've got Blue Origin, we've got Virgin. So what does this mean for the countries? Are they still having a big impact when it comes to space travel, or is it really the private companies leading the way now?
Today, it's really a public-private partnership, to be honest. We have gone through a little bit of a mini revolution where finally private space has taken up a very significant role in this public-private partnership. It used to be that NASA would have the big budgets, in excess of 20 billion. But in recent time, that's been chopped down quite a bit. So you've seen a quite significant reduction in NASA's budget under Trump. And at the same time, you have an enormous amount of capital going into private space companies, not just SpaceX and the most famous ones, perhaps, but also smaller companies that most people haven't heard about, that are raising 1 billion here, 5 billion there, etc. And they all have amazing capabilities. So it's a true public-private partnership that's now taking place. Part of that was induced by NASA outsourcing contracts on a vast scale. And that has really sort of taken a snowball effect, because when private enterprise gets involved, competition sets in, innovation sets in, lowering up costs sets in. And that's actually a very good way to do things. It's more efficient because it allows NASA and other agencies to focus on the outer space and research and development in places where there maybe isn't a commercial immediate applicability. Whereas the more ordinary task, like doing the taxi ride from Earth to the International Space Station, that can be done perfectly courtesy of, say, SpaceX. I mean, the Falcon 9 rocket accounted for almost half of the rocket launches last year. It's incredible. And it only had one glitch on one of the launches. Otherwise, it was perfect. So the private sector has an enormous role to play. But we still need the public sector in a big way as well for the outer space and the further away missions, etc.
Well, I'm still waiting to go on my space tour one day. I see that it's all happening with Blue Origin, and we're going to go and have a little holiday in space, aren't we, Per? We said that last time that we met, but we're still waiting for those prices to come down.
Well, we'll work on that. And with any market, you saw what happened to the low-cost air carriers. They've come down in price, and hopefully that will happen one way or another. But in any case, I hope you'll join when I head to space, hopefully in a not too distant future, and you'll follow me up there. But certainly we want to have space for more people, and we also want to inspire more kids to be interested in space science and STEM activities.
When are you going up? What's your date? And can we do an interview with you from space?
Absolutely, with great pleasure. With great pleasure. We're hoping to launch end of next year or early the following year. That's the ETA. They're building the Delta rocket right now in the Mojave Desert. As soon as that's ready, and as soon as they have tested it to make sure it works, then I put myself in the seat and fly to space. So yeah, come along. It should be good fun.
I would love to. Make sure it's tested, though, before I get on it. And also, I have to do some training. So astronaut Per Wimmer, thank you so much for joining us. A reminder of our top stories. Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff visits an aid distribution site in Rafah as the UN warn of a politically man-made famine in Gaza. The US reveals fresh tariffs for over 90 countries, with Canada and Brazil facing higher levies. And NASA and the Russian Space Agency meet face-to-face for the first time in 7 years to discuss continued collaboration in space. And that's all from us on W News. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and also follow us on X. The Rail Deal with Tom Burgess-Watson is coming up next. Plus, we'll be back in a couple of hours with the best of this week's W News Extra. Goodbye and thank you.